Okay, let's dive right into this. Welcome back to another explainer where we take a magnifying glass to the structures, the successes, and, well, the fascinating missteps of modern storytelling. Today, we're looking at a deeply intriguing piece of literary fiction called Myth Architect, the Book of Small Gods. Now, this story has sparked some intense debate among critics lately because, quite frankly, it's a brilliantly flawed novel. It builds this incredible, emotionally rich world, but then, well, it completely refuses to let that world actually challenge its protagonist.
So, to figure out exactly how this happens, here's our roadmap. First, we'll look at the brilliant premise. Second, the curse of cozy magic. Third, characters without real friction. Fourth, the meta-problem of winking at the audience. And finally, the fear of darkness.
All right, Section 1. A brilliant but flawed premise, divine hoarding.
Now, what's really interesting about this slide is the core concept itself. Because before we get into any critiques, we absolutely have to acknowledge that the setup of this novel is phenomenal. Think of the satirical edge of Terry Pratchett mixed with the modern mythological scope of Neil Gaiman, and then filtered through this deeply domestic, very specific kind of British sadness. Notice how the text defines these entities. These aren't your grand lightning-throwing gods from Mount Olympus. No, these are small gods, minor deities created by desperate human need. They just sort of persist in the forgotten corners of the world, hiding out in charity shop donation boxes and converted warehouse gems. And the kicker? They need human keepers to survive, kind of like how a houseplant needs water. It is an undeniable stroke of magical realism brilliance. It literally takes the abstract concepts of loneliness and purpose and physicalizes them into these abandoned religious objects. The sheer specificity of this pantheon is just breathtaking. But, it's also exactly where the cracks start to show. Look at the range we're dealing with here. We have Vasya, the god of kitchen gardens, who manifests as a ceramic figurine with its glaze totally worn away from generations of loving touches. Then you have the god of safe crossings, born from a broken curbstone and the unconsoled grief of a mother who lost her child. I mean, that is a compressed tragedy of abandoned belief right there. And then we have Percy, a piece of asphalt who is the god of finding parking spaces. Let's see how this massive shift in tone builds into our first major narrative problem.
Which brings us to Section 2, the curse of cozy magic, or what the critics are calling tonal whiplash.
So the novel sets up this incredibly heavy narrative potential, gods born of pure grief, but then almost immediately it starts fighting its own premise. On one side, we have profound tragedy. On the other, mundane absurdity. The god of parking spaces isn't just some funny background detail. He's super chatty and deeply invested in the theological significance of resident council permits. Critics hit the nail on the head when they pointed out that Percy acts as a very specific kind of comedic relief. Every single time the story threatens to get too dark or too heavy, Percy chimes in. He's there to ensure the reader is never actually broken by the heavier material. He's pure relief. He essentially acts like a giant mattress you just can't climb out of, padding every single sharp edge the story has. And this overwhelming desire for comfort extends right into the magic system itself. Just look at how divine intervention manifests in this world. It is aggressively subtle. The lights might dim a little bit, a god might shift in your peripheral vision. Honestly, the absolute pinnacle of magical power we see early on is a ceramic god aggressively encouraging a straggly basil plant to sprout tiny leaves on a windowsill. We're dealing with divine entities born of collective human psychic energy, and the magic practically begs you to ask, wait, did that actually happen, or do I just need to change my glasses? It's just so relentlessly cozy. But nowhere is this avoidance of real stakes more obvious than when the protagonist actually encounters a genuinely difficult deity. Our main character, Maya, finds this dark, obsidian god of sorrows. She touches it, and boom, she is plunged right into the fundamental grief of existence. She cries for 10 straight minutes. So how exactly does she resolve this crushing existential crisis? She literally calls the local hospice chapel and asks if they want a depressing supernatural paperweight for their altar. And they take it. Problem solved. She essentially uses a hospice as a dumping ground just to get her flat back to normal, completely bypassing the true emotional cost of the whole encounter.
Moving right along to Section 3, characters without real friction.
So the crucial point here is that our protagonist, Maya Chen, a 32-year-old millennial who is chosen by the narrative simply because she, quote, notices things, completely lacks any real struggle. And this trait is perfectly mirrored by her guide, Mrs. Kapoor. Honestly, Mrs. Kapoor is less of a flesh-and-blood human being and more of a walking literary trope.
Look at her inventory. She has 73 gods, a super cool 1920s ancestral backstory, a trusty thermos of chai, and 40 years of experience. But look at what she lacks. She doesn't have a single scene where she's actually wrong. Zero internal conflict, no real character arc. When she meets Maya, she acts way more like a multi-level marketing recruiter for divine refugees than a real person, just offloading her supernatural inventory onto Maya without ever facing a genuine challenge. And her dialogue reflects this perfectly. Listen to this. That is entirely irrelevant to whether they believe in you. It's snappy, it's profound. She is perfectly written to dispense exactly the right guidance at the exact right moment. She serves her purpose of seamlessly integrating Maya into this hidden world, and then, having transferred all the necessary knowledge and fulfilled her narrative function, she conveniently passes away exactly when the plot requires a transition. So Maya then inherits Mrs. Kapoor's network, which is this global online forum of fellow keepers. You've got Jennifer, the social worker in Brixton, David, the construction worker, and Sarah, the librarian. Now, an international network of regular people managing divine entities, that is inherently fascinating. Just imagine the intense theological disputes. Imagine the heated arguments between keepers who want to hoard gods versus those who want to place them back into the world. But what do we actually get? Validation. Every single post on this forum exists solely to validate Maya and make her feel successful. There is zero friction. The community is just there to make Maya feel less alone, but it never ever challenges her.
Let's look at Section 4, Winking at the Audience, the meta problem. As if the complete lack of internal conflict wasn't enough, the novel actually goes out of its way to undermine its own magic by explicitly breaking the fourth wall. The book literally opens with an author's note that says, "This story is fiction. Or is it? Walk through any charity shop, any junk market, any donation bin, and you'll find them." Critics absolutely tore this note apart, and for good reason. They argued it functions like this quirky, self-indulgent marketing pitch coming from inside the novel itself. It treats the magic like a fun, real-world scavenger hunt for the reader to play along with.
And this brilliantly illustrates the exact difference between magical realism that works and magical realism that plays it way too safe. Myth Architect winks at the reader. It invites you to go find the magic yourself. Now contrast that with Neil Gaiman's approach in a book like American Gods. Gaiman maintains absolute silence on the reality of his world outside the text. He treats magic as a terrifying reality that was already there, you just weren't paying attention. The wink in Myth Architect completely collapses that essential quality of doubt you need to make the magic feel dangerous or profound. And this whole lack of narrative confidence totally culminates in the novel's ending. Actually, scratch that. It's more like endings, plural, because the book stubbornly ends 3 separate times. First, with the immediate plot resolving, second, with a flash forward 10 years later, and third, with this massive cosmic zoom out to the gods witnessing the cycle of time. It's almost as if the book doesn't even trust its own emotional landing, turning what could have been a super powerful revelation into this repetitive mantra. It cushions the fall for the reader, just in case those first 2 endings didn't feel quite satisfying enough. Which leads us to our final point, Section 5, the fear of darkness. Here is where we find the foundational flaw of the entire narrative. We really have to ask ourselves, what is this book truly afraid of? Why does a story that is literally filled with abandoned gods, dementia, and profound grief insist on remaining so aggressively comfortable? Why do we need a chatty parking space god? Why does the mentor have to be perfectly, flawlessly wise? Well, the answer is that the book is terrified of the actual emotional stakes of its own premise. Just think about what hoarding these deities would really mean in practice. It means sustained proximity to compressed human desperation. It means hearing Vasya, the garden god's memories of decline and utter silence, not just once, but every single day. It means holding a piece of broken curbstone and bearing the unbreakable grief of a mother who lost her child, knowing for a fact that you cannot fix it. The book completely shields Maya from surviving an emotional cost she cannot cleanly metabolize. It gives her the routine, the practice to survive, but it never actually shows us the agonizing weight of the thing being survived. One of our critical sources sums up this flaw perfectly with a really profound, hard-hitting thesis. Kinder books tell harder truths. Myth Architect is a very kind book in its vibe and demeanor, but the most honest version of this story, the truly kind version that actually respects the immense weight of human suffering, would have demanded a real price for the magic. It would have allowed its protagonist to be genuinely wrecked by the sorrow she carries, and then shown us the profound strength it takes to wake up and keep carrying it anyway.
So I want to leave you with this final thought to chew on. In fiction, and, well, probably in life too, we usually want the wonder without the weight. We want the magic without the bill. But true magic, true meaning, usually comes with a heavy toll. If you could actually see the small gods hiding in the charity shops and on the street corners, would you be brave enough to survive the crushing weight of what they carry? Thank you so much for joining me for this explainer, and I'll see you next time as we continue to unpack the fascinating architecture of the stories we tell.